Okay, so we're going to continue in Esther. We'll be starting Esther Chapter 2 today. We'll go through verses 1 through 20. Like I said last week, I've never PowerPointed you guys in 2 years until last week. So I hope it was informative. I hope you guys were able to get something out of it, to glean something that you didn't know. That's something that, the trustability or reliability of the Bible is a very important topic to me, because if we're going to base our lives off a document, we should know that we can trust it. So that's where that comes from. Hopefully, for the ones that weren't here last Sunday, I put it on Facebook last night. So it should be on the church Facebook page if you want to check it out. I did rush. If I ever do that presentation again, I'm going to break it into 2 one-hour segments with a break in the middle so that I can take my time and not have to run through it. Turns out when you find a subject you're passionate about and you've studied a lot, you can talk a whole lot about it. So tonight we're going to do Esther chapter 2, verses 1 through 20, which is the bulk of the chapter. So here we go. All right. I got a couple questions to start with. Or I guess my question for you is, have these sort of questions ever run through your brain before? Why do the wicked prosper? Why do bad things happen to good people? They're difficult questions, and we often encounter them through the trials of our life. But one thing I've noticed is nobody ever seems to ask the opposite question of that, which is, why do zeros become heroes? Why is it that sometimes the nice guys do finish first? So tonight we're going to look at the sort of things that happen in the life of a person who's on that path, to go from zero to hero. We're only part of the way through the story of Esther, but you guys, we know how it ends, right? We started there up front. But keep that question in your mind, how do zeros become heroes as we read through this? Because what I'm going to try to draw your attention to is, what was it about Esther that was so special that God lifted her up from being an orphaned peasant to being the queen of the most vast empire of the world at the time? Right? That's quite a flop in position. And so with that in your mind, let's read and dive in. So Esther chapter 2, verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of King Xerxes had subsided, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decided against her. Then the young men of the king who attended to him said, "Let young virgins beautiful in appearance be sought for the king. And let the king appoint overseers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather every young virgin beautiful in appearance to the citadel of Susa, to the harem, into the hand of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who keeps charge of the women, and let their cosmetics be given to them. Then let the young lady who is good in the eyes of the king be queen in place of Vashti." And the word was good in the eyes of the king, and he did so. Now there was at the citadel in Susa a Jew, and his name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been taken away into exile from Jerusalem with the exiles who had been taken away into exile with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had taken away into exile. And he was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had no father or mother. Now the young lady was beautiful in form and beautiful in appearance, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Now it happened that when the word of the law of the king were heard, and many young ladies were gathered to the citadel of Susa into the hand of Hegai, that Esther was taken to the king's house into the hand of Hegai, who kept charge of the women. And the young lady was good in his eyes, and she advanced in loving kindness before him. So he hurried to give her cosmetics and portions of food to her, and to give her 7 choice young women from the king's house. And he transferred her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther did not tell anyone about her people or her kinsmen, for Mordecai had commanded her that she should not tell anyone about them. Verse 11. And every day Mordecai walked back and forth in front of the court of the harem to know the well-being of Esther and how she fared. Now when it reached the turn of each young lady to go in to King Xerxes after the end of her 12 months under the regulations for the women, for the days of their cosmetic treatment were fulfilled as follows: 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices in the cosmetics for women. Then the young lady would go into the king in this way. Anything that she said she desired was given to her to come with her from the harem to the king's house. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem to the hand of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who kept charge of the concubines. She would not again go in to the king unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Now when it reached the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she did not seek anything except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who kept charge of the women, said. And Esther advanced in favor in the eyes of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Xerxes to his royal house in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she advanced in favor and loving kindness before him more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen in place of Vashti. Then the king held a great feast, Esther's feast, for all his princes and his servants. He also held a remission of taxes for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's hand. And when the virgins were gathered together the second time, then Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not yet told anyone about her kinsmen or her people, just as Mordecai had commanded her. Indeed, Esther was doing what Mordecai declared that she do, just as she had done when she was being brought up by him. All right, verse 1. Let me say it's been at least 5 years since the last time we were in Esther, right? Not in actual time, but in historical time. King Xerxes became king in 480. Don't get me lying. I had it a week ago, like 486, 486. Yeah, right? And he threw the party that year. Now, when she's called to his house in verse 16, we're told it's the 7th year of his reign. And before it was in the 3rd year of his reign. So at least 4 years have passed since his little fallout with the queen, right? The drunken party thing. So I just, for perspective, now what was Xerxes doing for that 4 years? And why is coming up with his new queen just now becoming an issue? Well, remember when we were talking about the party, how I was talking about how he was trying to gather an army for his invasion of Greece? That's where Xerxes has been for the last 4 years. He went and invaded Greece. And so when he comes home, after his great conquest, he comes home to an empty palace. There's no loving wife or queen to greet him and dote on him. Oh, I'm so glad you're home from war. Poor guy. Right? So that, in my mind, right, that's why all of a sudden we go from this drunken party where he's going to throw the queen out, and now all of a sudden it's been 4 years, and it's like, why is it just now coming to his attention? Because he was busy on conquest, doing, you know why we conquest, Robert? The 3 G's: for God, glory, and gold. Right? Sorry, that's European history. That's another subject for another time. All right, verses 2 through 4. The young men at hand recommend to Xerxes that now he begin his search for a queen. They tell the king to let them seek out young virgins for him. They recommend he appoint overseers in each province to gather the women into Susa to the harem. They're to put under the guard of Hegai, who's in charge of the king's harem. And they're to be given their cosmetics, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And they tell Xerxes, and then you can sort through these women and find the one that's pleasing to you and make her queen in place of Vashti. And Xerxes says, hey, sounds good. Have you guys noticed so far in this book, Xerxes has not made any decisions of his own volition except for throwing a party. Every other thing he's done so far has been someone else says, hey, king, you should do this. And he goes, okay. You're going to see that continue. That's a trend through the whole book. It's kind of interesting. Here he is, ruler of the known world, and yet he doesn't have any of his own unique ideas, except invading Greece. Yeah, right? He said that, not me. I didn't get political this week. Okay. So I do want to point out they're not trying to gather every virgin in the Persian Empire, right? Just the most beautiful and best looking ones. They're going to get the choicest ladies to supply Xerxes as a pool to choose from, right? And then he's going to sift through the women provided to him and decide which one he wants to be his queen. He's not taking every eligible woman from across the known world. Wish dating was that easy, huh? All right, verses. I knew she would react that way. I can name her tune in one note. See, John, I learned a little bit about women. All right, verses 5 through 7. Now enters into our story Mordecai. He is a Benjamite, and his family was taken into exile under Nebuchadnezzar, which would have been 387. So it's been about 80 years since then, right? Which follows the biblical timeline perfectly. They were in exile 70 years. They were permitted to go back. They hadn't all gone back yet. That's the time period we're in. His family had been in captivity there for a while. He's at the citadel in Susa. Now, an ancient city, right, has the walls, and then there's an inner primary structure with a secondary wall. That is the citadel. If you think of a medieval castle, it would be the keep, right? So that if they're breaking through the walls, everyone can fall back to the intersection, and you have a second line of defense to hide in. So that's like the palace area. So basically, we're not told exactly what Mordecai does in Xerxes' court, but for him to be around the palace the way he is, he certainly had a job there. They don't just let random people into the king's palace. So he's not regularly before the king, but he always seems to be right around there. We're told Mordecai is raising Esther as his own daughter, or Hadassah, right? That's her Jewish name, Hadassah. And then Esther is her Persian or Babylonian name. Esther is a transliteration from Persian into Hebrew of the name Ishtar, which was one of the Babylonian gods. Ishtar was one of their primary gods, and she was the god of love, war, and fertility. Interesting combination. But much like Daniel and his companions, right, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were all renamed by the Babylonians to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They had names that honored the one true God, and then were given names that honored false Babylonian gods. Did the same thing to Esther, right? They took her Jewish name and gave her a Persian name to honor one of their false gods. Anyway, so we're told Esther's parents died when she was young, we assume, because it says she was left without parents. We also assume that Mordecai is a good deal older than her, if he was able to adopt her as his own daughter, right? Again, that is an assumption I'm making, but seems to point that way. She is said to be beautiful in form and appearance. So I can't tell you exactly what that means, but Sarah, if my memory is right, was described very much in the same way. And if you remember the escapades of Abraham and Sarah, everywhere he went, he had to snatch her back from the king of that area because he kept telling people she was his sister, and they were like, oh, she's an eligible lady, she's pretty. And then he had to go get her. You remember all that? So certainly Esther fits that mark of beauty. So in verses 8 through 11, many young women are gathered into the harem to be supervised by Haggai, and Esther is one of them. And apparently this Haggai was quite smitten with her. She was good in his eyes and advanced in loving kindness or grace, right? I don't know Hebrew. I don't really study Hebrew, but I did look at concordance and a Hebrew dictionary, and the word they translate there is loving kindness could also be translated grace. So he gives her a bunch of cosmetics, plenty of food, and then 7 women that I suppose were to be her servants to assist her in all her preparation for seeking the queenship. She's also given the best place in the harem. So whatever she did, or however it was that she conducted herself, Haggai was sure impressed. And I will remind you just real quickly that eunuch is a physical description, so it's not like she got all this favor and grace by any kind of impropriety, right? She does not tell anyone that she's Jewish. Mordecai specifically commanded her to remain tight-lipped about that, probably because it would ruin her chances to be the queen. There's a good chance that the king would not want to marry a woman who belonged to a people that have been enslaved and drugged back in exile, right? That's like kind of low class. It's below us. He would want a woman from a good background. And I guess their background checks in those days weren't as good as they are today. She squeaked by. So it says every day Mordecai was back and forth in front of the court of the harem to check on her. So I'm not sure exactly what that looked like either. Maybe he had a friend that worked in or around the harem, or maybe he was buddies with the eunuch and there was a way he could check on her and talk to her. Not real sure. It doesn't really say. All right, verses 12 through 14. I just remembered something that I meant to do at the very beginning and I didn't write it in my notes, and so I have to now. It's a fitting place anyway. Last time I taught on Esther, we had a disagreement in the Hayes home over terms. If you remember, she called me out while I was in the middle of teaching. I told her, we'll settle this at home. We did. And so we were both right. I'm happy to report we're both correct. So I said a bride price was paid by the husband's family to the woman's family to ensure her security in the future. And that is an absolute fact. The error I made was I used the term dowry as if it was synonymous with bride price, and it is not. The dowry was paid by the women's family to the men's family in later, like, England and France, Europe. So, she was right, but I wasn't wrong. All right. So in our context, in Esther, it was the bride price. And everything I said about that was correct. I just don't use the word dowry when you mean bride price, because they're two different things. And I didn't realize that. Honestly, I didn't know. So I love it when my wife calls me out and we go look it up and we're both right. That settles the argument really easily.
So dowry is a European concept?
Yes. Yeah, the bride price was a more ancient Near East.
So the dowry is, here, I'm going to pay you to take my daughter.
Mm-hmm.
The bride price is, we'll pay you for her.
Yes.
We'll pay you.
All right, verses 12 through 14. This is where it gets ugly. Let's start on the later half, on verses 13 and on the second half of verse 12 and verses 13 and the later half of the verse 12, and then we'll dive into the first half of it along with verses 13 and 14. So the 12 months of preparation for each lady. We're going to talk about that first, and then we'll go back and combine verse 12, 13, and 14 to make it all make sense. They spend 6 months anointing themselves with oil and myrrh, and then 6 months with spices and ointments. This time period likely had a couple of reasons. First and foremost, it was a sufficient period of time to ensure the woman was not pregnant and had not become pregnant since she came to the harem. How bad would it be if you got this pretty young girl and he picks her and she pops up pregnant, 6 months into the process? Oh, she wasn't a virgin when she got here. So that's part of it, right? To make sure she's actually, and along with that, to make sure she is maintained her fidelity toward the king after arriving in the harem. So I imagine they were watched over pretty closely, these women, but I do know world history, and I know how royal bloodlines tend to go, and not everyone's always faithful. So that would be the first purpose. The next purpose would be, this is a period of time for the women to be educated and participate in what I have entitled extensive beautification. So first of all, education. This education is not a formal education like you're probably thinking of. They weren't taught to read and write. But what they would be taught is etiquette, right? How to interact with nobles, how to interact with the king, some understanding of the Persian law. They probably would have been instructed on how to perform different rituals or customs and how to dance properly. Believe it or not, in royal courts through all of history, dancing is extremely important, apparently. It's part of, I don't know, showing your class, I guess, and getting it wrong is embarrassing. So these are the things that prospective queens would have been exposed to in this waiting period. And then extreme beautification, a period of time where the women would bathe regularly, learn how to make themselves look their best, right? This is, in essence, what's happening or about to happen is a glorified beauty pageant. And so they're finding the makeup combination and the hairstyle that makes them look the most attractive, right? So they want to put their best foot forward because, let's face it, I'd rather be the queen. All right, so now that brings us to the first half of verse 12 and verses 13 and 14. So the first half of verse 12 says, "Now when it reached the turn of each young lady to go in to King Xerxes after the end of her 12 months. This is absolutely, in a biblical sense, to go into someone to know them. The young lady would go into the king, be permitted to take anything she wanted from the harem with her in order to help her woo the king. She would go in the evening and depart in the morning, and then be returned to the harem of the concubine, which is assigned to a different eunuch." So each of these women, man, I missed a part of my notes. Didn't I? Oh, I did. Yeah. I really did. So I wrestled with this. I looked for someone that interpreted it differently or commentator that understood it in another way because I don't like it. It doesn't fit with our modern sensibilities or our Christian ethics that he would gather all these gorgeous women, shove them in a hole for 12 months so they can pretty themselves up, and then try them out one night apiece until he picked a queen. That's really pretty ugly, and it's pretty repulsive, but that is what happened. All right, so all these women were gathered in the first harem and do their training for 12 months and their beautification, and the final test is to spend a night with the king. She's not permitted to return to the king unless asked for by name, so you'd have to make quite an impression on him. And I do want to point out that at this point, she is unmarriable as a woman, right? Because she's no longer a virgin. But that doesn't mean she'd be destitute the rest of her life, right? She would become a concubine of the king. Now, doubtless, it would be a completely loveless and pretty horrible existence to be used for one night and then put in the harem of the concubines. But at least she was guaranteed for the rest of her life to have a roof over her head, to have clothes, and to have food. It's not a great consolation prize, so to speak, but that may be exactly what Mordecai had in mind when he sent her in there, to make sure he could care for her. I don't know. The text doesn't say, but I'm certain it was not pleasant for her. I don't know. Anyway, I'm not trying to justify the behavior, but that does seem to be what happened. But at least she wouldn't be thrown on the street like a common prostitute, you know. Verses 15 and 16, when the time comes for Esther to go meet Xerxes, she asks the eunuch what he thinks she should take with him. And so I pondered on this quite a bit too. Like, what do you take with you to the king's house? Maybe some of these ladies knew how to play an instrument, and so they'd bring an instrument so they could play a song. Maybe some of them, I know this wouldn't translate directly into Persia, but what are they? The canastas, the little clicky things that girls dance with, right? Maybe. Yeah, I mean, it could be a number of things, right, that she would bring from the harem with her to help her impress the king. She's going to the most important job interview of her life, so to speak, and she's going to try and, I don't want to say sell herself, but just like at a job interview, you're trying to sell yourself to this guy that you want to give you some money. Like, I want you to hire me, so let me tell you how good I am. So I imagine it was those sort of things that would be brought in with them from the harem. But all we're told is that she only takes with her what Haggai recommends, and then we get the timing of it, 7th year of Xerxes' reign. And then verses 17 through 20, Xerxes loves Esther more than any other of the women, so he puts the crown on her head and makes her the queen. And Vashti has now officially been replaced. Xerxes holds a great feast in her honor. It's called Esther's Feast. And he also gives out gifts to the populace and suspends taxes for a period of time. So this was actually a very common practice in the ancient world. when kings and emperors came back from campaigns, especially successful ones, they would have a big triumph where they entered in the city on their war horse with their armies behind them, and they're dragging the slaves they brought back and all the gold and statues and stuff they've plundered, right? And it's literally a parade to celebrate their military conquest. And in times like that, they would suspend taxes, and that's why Rome was so popular. They gave them bread and blood, right? That's what the Colosseum was. They threw bread to the populace and then put on a show. So Xerxes does the same thing in celebration of his wedding, right? Oh, we're going to suspend taxes. Here's he's like, Oprah, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car, right? Anyway, he was probably pretty elated with his new bride, and we're reminded that Esther has not yet told anyone about her lineage, so she's keeping that secret even though she's the queen. So that's plenty of information for us, but what does it teach us, and what do we do with it practically? How do we apply it? So I have two things I want to point out to you in thinking about these verses. The first one is never underestimate God and his ability to have his will done in the world. I've heard it said, and I will repeat it myself, there is not a single rogue molecule in this universe. Every single one, every bit of our existence is under the complete and sovereign control of God. He is creator of all things, ruler of all things, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. And although we may not always see what God has in the works, we can rest and take joy in the fact that we know his will is being accomplished. We know that all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. God is always orchestrating and guiding the next steps and the next moves of the world. And even when we're completely unaware of what's going on, God is working to his will and to our sanctification. Think about Joseph, what that poor man went through. Sold into slavery, carried off to Egypt, falsely imprisoned, left to rot in the dungeon, and then at the right time, raised up where he could provide salvation to Israel. Joseph himself told his brothers that what they intended for evil, God intended for good. So I started out asking, why do bad things happen to good people? Ask Joseph. For God's redemptive plan for mankind to be carried out in time for his glory, for his worship, and for his praise. And the next thing I asked you is, why do zeros become heroes? And the answer is the same. However, in most cases, there's generally something else. Notice through all of tonight's verses how obedient Esther was. She didn't reveal her lineage. She listened to the wisdom and advice of her cousin. She listened to the wisdom and advice of the eunuch appointed over her. And even on the fateful night when she was thrown to the king to be tried out before marriage, she was obedient to that. Esther's described throughout this chapter as one who garners favor and grace from the ones she encounters. And I tend to think this is due to her obedience, not just to men, but to God. When Wendy and I started studying the books of Moses and started really getting into Exodus and the law, we discussed in great detail why all these little rules. Why aren't they allowed to eat shrimp? Why do they have to wash in this way before they eat? In Deuteronomy 11:1, Moses commands Israel, "You shall therefore love Yahweh your God and keep his charge, his statutes, his rules, and his commandments always." And in John 14:15, more pointedly, Jesus says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." Obedience to God and love for God have always been somewhat synonymous. If you truly love God, you should aspire to learn his commandments and what is required of you as a Christian and seek to follow them with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. There's no greater sign of our love for him than our obedience to him. Let the example of Esther and her obedience be your guide as something to aspire to. We should all seek to be better slaves to Christ. And as John Green prayed for just a few minutes ago, we should seek to be the disciples that he would have us to be. Don't take for granted the salvation given to you by faith. Persist in goodness and good works. Persist in deeds that are in keeping with the faith and obedience to the commands of Jesus. Not because you fear hell and not because you know it's what you should do, but because you love him that dearly. I am absolutely certain that if there was any other way for it to be accomplished, Jesus would have loved to not be nailed to that cross. But he obeyed God and the will of God so that redemption could be obtained. If God the Son was willing to be obedient, even to the point of death on a cross, we should be willing to be obedient to so much more. I'm not telling you that you should live in sinless obedience. It's not possible. But I do think that we should all exert our best effort to obey Christ. Rest in God and His will. Rest in Christ and His work. Let yourself be comforted and joyous in all that He does. And when the opportunity to obey and serve Him shows itself, take advantage of it. That's it. Questions? Yes.